All right, folks, I want to finish up talking about chapter 22, just a few more things. I want to talk about the academy or the institution of art. So the institution, when you talk about the institution or the institutional theory of art, you're talking about what the books or the museums or the galleries or who's ever in charge tells you is important. And in this chapter, towards the end of this chapter, we start talking about one of these institutions, and this one is the French Academy, and how important they were in deciding what was important, what was art. So we talked about this particular image and why it was controversial. To give a little bit of background, I want to remind you of this piece. So we've looked at this a long time ago, Venus of Urbino, and you should immediately see how similar these are. You've read about it too. But notice obviously the woman naked, lying on the front, in the foreground, person to the right behind her. Oops, sorry, I went the wrong way. Two people behind her. We have this division through the middle, so we have a wall and then a different kind of space. Here, wall and a different kind of space. So there's closer wall, and then this is just kind of farther away from us. Notice the cat, and it's replacing the dog, essentially. Now, this is not an accident. It's not like Manet just happened to come up with the same composition. This was very intentional. And one of the things that's important to understand about this is how typical this kind of art was. So this is Venus. This is quite a bit earlier, but this particular Venus of Urbino is pretty typical. You'll see some comparisons. This one's in the chapter, our current chapter, chapter 22. Naked ladies, they're voluptuous, they're curvy, they're, gallivanting or hanging around or whatever. I like to show this little magazine cartoon by Daumier. And Daumier, you've seen in this chapter before. He did this. He did this. Both of these realism in the style of realism, depicting what life is really like. This one, make sure you read about the reason. This is not a drunk. This is not somebody who's just fallen asleep. Make sure you read about the reason behind that particular artwork. Anyway, this is a cartoon Daumier painted, a lithograph he did it was published in 1865. And these women are at the Salon, so the French Academy that we're talking about, and they're saying, in French, of course, still more Venuses this year, always Venuses. And they're referring to all of these paintings that are very much of a kind. They're very much like this, naked ladies, hanging out, being beautiful to look at, that kind of thing. Frolicking or resting or whatever it is. And this is what's accepted by the institution. This is high art, important art. This is, if you paint like this and you paint skillfully and all your edges are nice and clean and you've got beautiful women and beautiful textures and illusion of depth and proportions and stuff like that. These are appealing. These are what gets in. Let me see if I can pop to the next one. We've seen this one before as well. All of these are totally accepted by the Academy when Manet comes around. So Manet is referencing all of these other paintings, but he's made some important changes. And those changes are what is offensive, or why people think, this is terrible work. Interestingly, today, this is so fairly well known that other works reference it. So this one today is so famous that we have things like this. Yasumasa Morimura. Sorry, I did a screenshot and left the arrows in there. But clearly this one is referencing that one. So we have this long train of this referencing this, which is then this, then this, then this, then this. So today we don't see this particular one as all that offensive because this one has come along after it. And this one is, or at least in 88, was shocking. But at the time, there were several things that were shocking. Not her nudity, and that's really important. It's not shocking that she is nude. We've seen plenty of nudes. That is not upsetting to people at the time. What is upsetting is who she is. So there are some clues. One of the things is she's not a curvy, voluptuous Venus. She's fairly skinny. Another is the way she's dressed. Quote unquote dressed. Obviously she's not dressed, but she's wearing the neck thing. She's got her shoes on. Those are signs that she is not just, Here we've come across Venus. She just happens to be laying around naked like you do. And she looks, she's sort of meant to look like we've just happened upon her. Like she's just hanging around, just happens to be naked. She's not waiting for anyone. She's kind of looking at us, but she's supposed to be kind of resting too. Here, something like this, they just happen to be playing with their satyr, in the nude, like you do, I guess. But here, this is clearly a prostitute, and we're meant to recognize that. The fact that she's looking at us, she's alert, she's aware of us, that her lady who works for her is bringing her flowers, and the flowers come from who she's looking at, which is meant to be probably her, her suitor, her guy coming to meet with her. And then the cat is awake, he gets startled, and this isn't just an unlucky black cat, which is how we think of it today, but it's supposed to tell us that he's aloof. She's aloof. The cat is a symbol, just like the dog is a symbol. Oops, sorry. Keep going to the wrong one. Just like the dog is a symbol here of loyalty, he's undisturbed, he's just happened to be hanging out there. The cat here is a symbol that she has been interrupted, and that she's this independent woman. Right? And so that is part of what's upsetting about this artwork. The other thing that is really hard for us to understand is the messiness with which this is painted is upsetting. So the fact that we see the brush strokes, that the surfaces, the edges, what is going on back here? We can't really tell. It's kind of roughed in, right? We can see the outline, the way the paint was drawn around her edges and things. Whereas when we look at something like this, there's a focus on these surfaces being really smooth, really clean, colors sort of staying in their own area. The surface is very perfect, right? Sort of a formal artifice of the way the painting is done, as opposed to here where we can see the paint. We can tell that this is a painting. We can see that it was painted with, material. And that was actually upsetting at the time. That was something that people reacted to negatively. And again, in comparison to something like this, it's a little hard for us to understand. Notice here again, we have a symbol for the animal, but here it's still a black cat, but it's become a maneki neko, or a lucky Japanese cat. Sort of an interesting comparison there. Honore Domi. So that is the French Academy. That is some little hint of what's accepted, and then where we're breaking the rules. The realism, the art that is realism, is similarly breaking some of these rules. We see the way it's crafted. We see the lines for how the marks were made and things like that. I want to talk about one more category of things as we finish up. There are some, I just want to talk the top part here, modern and postmodern references. So there's just some fun stuff that we can talk about with regards to several of these artworks. So we looked at in gray previously in earlier in the chapter. We've already talked about some of the artifice here and the backbone and stuff like that. But what's another way of talking about this one is to talk about feminist art. So hopefully you recognize the imagery here, except she has a different head. So this is the poster and bumper sticker and stuff done by the Guerrilla Girls, who came around in the 70s but are still going today. This one was from 2011, the numbers here, and the Guerrilla Girls are talking about why women are not represented as makers. We don't see the women's voices so much. This is the Metropolitan Museum of Art. This is the modern art section, so we shouldn't, that's stuff being made in the 20th and 21st century. So this should not be art that is super restricted. In the early 20th century, there were certainly restrictions on whether women could go to particular schools and learn art, but not the kind of restrictions that we saw in the Renaissance period with the guilds, or with Artemisia Gentileschi. But still, less than 4% of the artists in the modern art section are women. And when we do have women, they are the subjects. And so something like this, which again is older, but they reference this particular painting because if you ask who has the power in this image, one of the fascinating things is a lot of these Venus pictures, it is about the viewer's power, the male viewer's power, excuse me, wrong ones I'm getting to. So something like this is about her being a sort of an available object to look at. Someone who is there for men. The point of this painting is beautiful women's bodies and sort of voyeuristic, being able to look at these beautiful women's bodies. And of course, these are painted by men, and this is a male fantasy of what a harem would be like. Would it be like to go to a harem or something like that? And so the Guerrilla Girls are bringing that out Guerrilla Girls are bringing that out as a concern and questioning why is it that we don't see women's representation. This is something we'll talk a little bit more about in the next quarter if you're interested in that. I also want to bring you into the modern contemporary time. This is recent. This artwork we looked at in chapter 21. This is a work by Kehinde Wiley that is from 2005. And the reason I bring this up right now, we'll talk about the work in a second, but you might recognize the name of the artist. Because recently he was in the news for this painting. So this was the official portrait of President Barack Obama, and it was painted by Kehinde Wiley. And Kehinde Wiley is known for these sort of extravagant paintings that have extravagant backgrounds on these paintings of African American subjects, and often African American subjects referencing more familiar artwork from a previous time. So clearly you should recognize the composition and the subject. We have Napoleon, we have the horse this way, we have the cape thing, the red fabric around him, even the writing on the stone. And Kehinde Wiley has pulled a lot of that information into his painting, but he's swapped out our subject. So we have obviously a black man, and then we have him in mostly contemporary clothing, except for the drapey thing around him. So it's just kind of, I thought that would be fun to end talking about. All right. Let me know if you have questions as you're working on this chapter.